Welcome to today's Explainer. We have got a wildly fascinating academic working paper to unpack today by M.R. Williams, titled A Tale of Two Investors, Bifurcated Investment Strategies for a Post-Labor World. Let's dive right in, because this paper presents a massive, rigorous thought experiment. It looks at the rapidly evolving landscape of financial technology and asks a pretty profound question. What happens to the global investable universe if our highly digitized future violently collides with widespread labor displacement? Well, according to Williams, the entire investment landscape doesn't just shift, it completely splits in two. Because this paper synthesizes a ton of complex data, we're going to follow a straightforward roadmap today. We'll hit the ABCD architecture, look at two macro conditions, explore the investor bifurcation, examine the 10 core technologies, and wrap up with the confiscation spectrum.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the ABCD architecture. To set the stage for this speculative future, we first have to understand the foundational setup. A stands for artificial intelligence. And look, in the context of this new financial paradigm, we aren't just talking about your everyday chatbots. We are talking about highly integrated decision systems, predictive models, and autonomous agentic workflows that are executing vast amounts of operations across the financial sector.
Moving right along, B is for biometric identification. Think of this as taking your physical self, your face, your fingerprint, maybe even your behavioral data, and perfectly anchoring it to your digital wallet and financial settlements. Literally, your biological identity becomes your financial key.
Then we have C, representing central bank digital currency, or CBDC. This is a game changer. It introduces programmable identity-linked money at the settlement layer. We're talking about currency that is directly issued and managed by governments, completely replacing or subsuming traditional anonymous cash.
And finally, D is the digital financial system. You can think of this as the ultimate infrastructure layer. These are the integrated digital rails securely connecting the AI, the biometrics, and the digital currency all together into one completely seamless, frictionless environment. Put it all together, and you get the complete ABCD architecture. As the paper points out, these aren't isolated tools. They are four mutually reinforcing technological systems emerging in parallel right now, feeding into each other to create this massive technological constellation. But technology doesn't just exist in a vacuum, which brings us to the friction.
That leads us to Section 2, two macro conditions. Now that we know the architecture being built, the author introduces the two massive shifts that actually trigger the central conflict here. He asks us to consider a joint contingency. Condition 1, the ABCD architecture fully matures. And honestly, this is highly plausible, seeing as how 146 jurisdictions are already exploring CBDCs today. Condition 2, a sudden post-labor response where the state deploys universal basic income to offset massive job losses. So if perfectly trackable technology matures right as UBI is deployed, we hit a profound fork in the road for anyone holding capital.
Which brings us to Section 3, the investor bifurcation. Under this high-stakes what-if scenario, the author argues that the entire investable universe violently splits into two distinct ideological camps. To ground this theory, the paper leverages Hirschman's classic 1970 framework, which maps out how people naturally respond to systemic shifts through either exits, voice, or loyalty. In this new world, investors have to choose: do they remain loyal to the new system, try to use their voice to change it from the inside, or just completely exit?
The paper also pulls in the concept of socially responsible investing, specifically negative screening. You know how some modern investors categorically exclude sin stocks like tobacco or gambling? It's exactly like that, but here they aren't avoiding vice, they are applying a strict screen to completely avoid funding this new financial matrix.
This framework perfectly illustrates our two resulting camps. On one side, we have the participants. These are the investors willingly allocating capital into the ABCD buildout. They're adopting that loyalty stance by passively allocating, or voice by engaging with it. On the flip side, we have the resistance. These folks are hitting the exit button. They completely screen out the ABCD architecture and refuse to fund it.
What is truly fascinating here is how that resistant camp fractures even further. You have resistant A, which is avoidance only. They apply the negative screen to avoid complicit companies, but otherwise they hold a standard portfolio. They live with the architecture, they just decline to fund it. But then you have resistant B. Now this is a much more hardcore subgroup. They don't just avoid, they build entirely new carry-forward portfolios featuring exit vectors specifically designed to preserve their wealth and survive an adverse systemic collapse. Moving to Section 4, the 10 core technologies.
So once the investor world splits, where does the capital actually flow on this new technological battlefield? Well, beyond the four main ABCD legs, there are 6 critical supporting technologies. Think of these as the picks and shovels that make the architecture possible. Everything from the cloud computing and big data that feed the AI to the smart contracts and real-world asset tokenization required for embedded finance.
When you map these investor classes against those 10 technologies, stark divisions emerge. While participant investors are heavily funding AI and CBDCs, the resistant groups completely exclude them. Instead, the resistants pivot their capital into alternative defensive postures, most notably pouring money into privacy-preserving cryptography to shield their assets from the exact same system the participants are building.
Finally, we reach Section 5, the confiscation spectrum. Now, you might be wondering, why? Why would that resistant B camp take such drastic exclusionary measures with their capital? It all comes down to their fear of this asset continuity spectrum. They're terrified that as society transitions, legacy assets could face 5 plausible end states. State 1 is full continuity, where your wealth is perfectly preserved, but as you slide down the spectrum, past soft conversions and selective haircuts, you descend all the way to State 5, total extinction. Literally, legacy assets being entirely wiped out or rendered fundamentally incompatible with the new digital paradigm.
And Williams makes it very clear this isn't just some sci-fi paranoia. He anchors these terrifying end states in real historical precedents. Look at the 1933 U.S. gold prohibition, where private gold was compelled into the Federal Reserve, or the 1948 occupied Germany currency reform, which resulted in massive asset destruction, or even the 2013 Cyprus bank haircuts, where insured deposits were just levied overnight. History is absolutely full of moments where citizens saw their wealth radically altered or confiscated during systemic transitions. The resistance? They're simply bracing for the next one.
So the big takeaway here is that this paper isn't necessarily predicting exactly what will happen, but it provides a masterful framework for understanding how capital might defensively or opportunistically organize itself in the face of unprecedented technological change. As we wrap up this thought experiment, I've got to ask you, if the ABCD architecture arrives tomorrow alongside a sudden post-labor shift and the financial rules of the world are rewritten overnight, which camp of investor will you belong to?